Köszöntöm nézőinket, szervusztok! A mai vendégem Kathleen Stock, brit filozófus, 1 évvel ezelőttig a Sussex Egyetem oktatója, aki azért szüntette meg oktatói státuszát, mert azt érezte, hogy elfogyott a levegő körülötte az egyetem falai között. Azért érezte ezt, mert a különböző nézetei miatt, a biológiai nem, illetve a szexuális identitások kapcsolatáról egész egyszerűen olyan támadásokat váltott ki az egyetem polgárságából, hogy úgy érezte jobbnak, hogyha megszünteti oktatói státuszát. Hogy miért hozta meg ezt a döntést, és ezen kívül egyébként miért érdekes a személye, ez fog kiderülni a mostani beszélgetésből, amelynek apropóját 2 ügy adja. Az egyik, hogy a napokban zajlott le egy leszbikus konferencia Magyarországon, amelyen Kathleen is részt vett, így személyes tapasztalata is vannak az ott elhangzottakról, illetve hogy hamarosan meg fog jelenni magyarul is Materiális című kötete, a magyar címet én nem tudom, hogy mi lesz, de ez az eredeti címe. Ebben a kötetben publikálta a nézeteit a biológiai nem és a szexuális identitások között fennálló kortárs ellentmondások és viták összességéről. Rendkívül izgalmas kötet, most alapvetően erről lesz szó. Azonnal bemutatom őt, de mielőtt ezt megtenni, mindenképpen iratkozzatok fel a csatornára, ha még nem tettétek volna meg, illetve ha lehetőségetekben áll, akkor kérlek, hogy fizessetek elő a Partizánra, szálljatok be a finanszírozásunkba a leírásban található lehetőségeken keresztül. Hello, Kathleen, welcome to the show and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, you are here in Budapest because of the lesbian conference. What are your observations and why did you choose to participate in such an event?
Well, I chose to participate because in the UK I'm in the process of starting a new organisation which is at the beginning of its development on behalf of lesbians. And so I wanted to hit that project has an international dimension in the sense that we'd like to build some kind of network between lesbian communities internationally and really reassert the word lesbian and the fact of lesbians in public life generally, because they are really disappearing. So I came over to this conference to really just see what was happening. Now, this conference was in fact exceptionally queer in the sense of, in a theoretical sense, that they took this stance on what they would call inclusivity, and you know, as far as they're concerned, it's the LGBT community or the LGBTIQ, etc. community that they're interested in. And although they say they're interested in lesbians, you know, they would include biological males in that group. Now, I don't agree with that, so it was quite a difficult event to actually experience for me, actually. And then they ended up excluding, ironically, a lesbian friend of mine, Faika El-Nagashi, on the eve of the conference because of her allegedly unacceptable views. So that added another dimension.
Did you observe any views from the Eastern European, Central Asian activists which can challenge the Western hegemony in these questions?
No, I didn't. And I'm afraid, and I actually went to a panel where there was a speaker from Albania and a speaker from Georgia. And they did say some, you know, I was interested in what they had to say. And one of the speakers from Georgia said exactly that there was a problem in Georgia that they could only use the language of the West to talk about lesbian identity and that they really should find their own language. But this very same speaker started her presentation by saying, I am a queer woman and my pronouns are she and they. Now, that language did not come from Georgia. You know, the language of pronouns of she, they came from the States. Mm-hmm. So I found that there was a tension in the observation that they should find their own language, and the fact that, in fact, across this panel, which was geographically diverse and socioeconomically diverse, there was very similar language used all the time, similar explanations, similar theoretical constructs, a very simplified worldview where queer people are considered as this unit, and there's no room for looking at the differences between the members of this supposed community. And that's what I find difficult, because I think lesbians disappear.
Let's talk a little bit about trans identities, because I think it's an interesting question. That what is the historical difference, in your view, between the history of the struggles of the lesbian, the homosexual, the bisexual community, and the current struggles of the trans communities for acceptance, for acceptance in general?
Well, I think that there's a common element to both struggles, no doubt, because generally people have a problem, not generally people, but some people have a problem with nonconformity, sexual nonconformity, nonconformity of gender presentation, women like me that dress like boys, and boys that dress like girls. So there's a kind of vague umbrella way in which, yes, there's homophobia, there is transphobia, there are assaults on both communities. However, there are differences because lesbians and gays are reviled, where they are reviled, for their sexual orientation, for the people that they're attracted to and the people that they have sex with. And it's the same sex, basically. I mean, I'm spelling out the obvious, but it's not obvious anymore because according to this new idea, lesbianism and gayness for men, homosexuality for men is an identity, just like trans is an identity. So it's the language is displaced from talk of sexual orientations, which is a fact about you and your behavior. It's a fact about your behavior, to an identity, which is a chosen, sort of self-designated, well, in some sense. I mean, they're very vague about whether it's essential or self-designated. But so those are two. That's an important difference. But the other thing I wanted to say was, like I said just now, when people discuss the lesbian community or the gay community or the transgender community, they don't differentiate between different locations. Like the experience of a trans woman in England is very, very different to the experience of a trans woman in Albania. I have no doubt about that. And yet again, there's no room for acknowledging that in some countries like the UK, there is relatively little violence against trans people. There's been, thank God, no trans murders for 3 years, and there was only one a year for the last 10 years. You know, it's very small numbers. But the sort of rhetoric around the threat to trans people is always the same, whichever country you go from. And there are some countries where trans people are very much under threat, especially in South America, where a relatively high number of trans people, trans women are killed, and differences in the West. And so I would actually just reject this framing of like, there's a fact about the experience of gay people and there's a fact about the experience of trans people. It really does depend, obviously depend on their context.
I think everyone can argue who are sympathetic with the trans activists' causes that gender dysphoria is just as old as humankind. I think so. I think so. Don't you think it's time right now where those people who are already acknowledged by society, homosexuals, bisexuals, and so on, should show solidarity for the current struggles of trans people who are right now in the phase of, struggling and fighting for acceptance and for rights? Well, I 100% agree they should show solidarity, right? I think there's nothing wrong with diverse groups showing solidarity with each other. But what does that mean? And what is being demanded in order to show solidarity? And a very, very narrow view is being demanded by the LGBTI overlords, as it were, or the dominant ideology that was in the ELC conference when I was there and is in British institutions and is in France and in Germany and all over the place at the moment. And that's a very narrow line which says, in order to show solidarity, you have to accept that trans women are literally women, that trans men are literally men, and that non-binary people are neither. You have to accept that. You can never question it. Wherever there's a tension between sex and gender identity, sex has to disappear. Talk of sex has to disappear. Data about sex has to disappear. Any separate spaces for the female sex have to be inclusive. Right, so that's not showing solidarity anymore. That's imposing a very one-sided set of interests on people. And I disagree with a lot of that for good reasons. I just want you to clarify, please, what does that mean that sex has to disappear? Well, in the UK, where I'm from, it's a very
a strange situation, I think, because this quite radical set of ideas, trans women are women, trans men are men, and so on, has come through HR departments, basically, into lots of institutions. So you have to, these institutions feel that they have to change all their policies to remove any reference to biological sex. So where they might have made a difference formally between women's changing rooms and men's changing rooms, for instance, female and male, they will now say in their policies, anyone who identifies as a woman can go in the women's changing room. Anyone, including males who identify as women. I mean, there's some kind of additional nonsense talked about, oh, well, there's not really any males or females anyway. You know, there's some kind of bolstering of that idea. But basically, if you identify as a woman, you can go in the women's bathrooms, changing rooms, dormitories, halls of residence. You can join the women's sports team. You can go to the Women's Rape Crisis Service. You can go into the domestic violence shelter. So all of these spaces that were formerly uncontroversially female only, built by feminists in the 70s, a lot of them, like the rape crisis shelters and the domestic violence services, painfully built by women for women, have now changed their policies to allow men in, basically. Although then we're not supposed to say that they're men. And that's transphobic if you do say that, so obviously I'm called transphobic. So that's what I mean. There's no female-only resources anymore, and data collection has changed. So in many places, they say, are you a man or a woman? But you can choose which one you want based on how you feel. So, and that has real consequences for academic understanding of the sexes and social experiences of each of them. And it has consequences for women in particular, wherever they are disadvantaged structurally by their sex.
I would like to hear your reflection on some of the arguments that are coming from not just right-wing, from right-wing politics, but also from liberal or left-wing politics as well, that when they are saying that trans identities or non-binary identities are a danger for children, or it is a fashion. So these seems to me very same as the ones were used against homosexuals in the 60s or in the 50s or before. What is your take on this?
Well, I'm pretty clear that I have no objection whatsoever. In fact, I think it's positively healthy if children play around with identities. I have no problem whatsoever with a little boy in a ballet dress or a little girl climbing trees and dressing as a footballer and playing football. You know, I have no problem with any of that. I just don't think it's reasonable to worry about that, because children are finding their way and you can't really control that stuff anyway very successfully. My worry is very specific. It's about children thinking that a girl, for instance, who plays football and who likes hanging around with her brothers and who doesn't really like playing with girls and dolls, starting to think she's a boy. And my problem with that is that there's now a pathway she can quite easily be put on, which is a medical pathway, and she reaches puberty in Britain. She might be in a gender identity clinic being given drugs to retard her puberty, and that has a number of severe physical consequences. But do you think that's a significant phenomenon? Yes. It's a growing phenomenon, I'm afraid. For instance, there was a 5,000% rise in attendees at children attending the UK's National Health Service Gender Identity Clinic over 10 years, and that was girls. And there was a significant rise in boys too. So the numbers have gone up. It's a phenomenon of social contagion, partly because our institutions are so bought into the idea that children can be trans. So I just want to be clear, my worry is not about the impropriety of gender stereotypes being violated. My worry is about children being made infertile or children being put on a path which means they will cut their breasts off at 15 or 16, which is what's happening in the States with some girls. So, I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but it is happening, and it's up to the left to reject this because the right will use it against them.
That would be my next question. So what could be the common ground? Because I think, most of the people doesn't take care about it.
No.
But they see that there is another fraction within the left wing. And as just you were saying, the right wing is using it against the left.
Yeah.
So they can completely reshape the political agenda on the daily level. So what could be the common ground, that how can these sexual minorities, gender minorities be united?
Well, I also just, before I answer that, want to point out that a large proportion of the children who are identifying as trans and who are being put onto this medical pathway are same-sex attracted. So this is actually, my position is protecting gay children who will probably go on to be gay from being confused about their identity and irrevocably harming their bodies. But I really don't think it's difficult to find common ground here. I think when people understand the harms that are happening to children, some children in gender identity clinics in the West, and it's mainly, Germany, the UK, the States, as far as I know, when people understand that, right or left, they understand the concept of evidence-based medicine. They understand the concept of long-term studies into the effects of drugs on children. They understand the concept of consent, and that children are not normally thought to be able to consent to things that they don't understand, particularly about their future. So, like, you can't get it to 2 in England. There's a law that says you can't get it to 2 before a certain age because it's assumed you won't make a good decision necessarily. So why would we put children who don't understand themselves, their bodies, their sexuality, or the world on a pathway before they're able to understand it? So that's not a radical position. It's a position that most reasonable people can see once it's explained to them that that is what's happening. So I think partly it's a matter of information and also getting all the kind of chaotic, toxic fighting out of the way and just go back to what's important, which is protecting vulnerable people. It's not against trans people. It's not about adults. It's in this case.
But what would be an adequate protection, and what would be an adequate acceptance of adults who are identifying themselves as non-binaries or trans?
So is this a question about the adult population rather than
absolutely.
the child? Well, I mean, I don't personally see that there's anything to be done or any particular ethical problem. I mean, people would disagree with me about this, about surgical transition. If you feel very strongly that it would help you and you've been through enough talking therapy and really thought about it, I mean, I don't want to live in a kind of world where people cannot make those sorts of decisions for themselves. So I'm relatively liberal about those things. But you have to remember that the discussion in Britain has got really nothing to do with adults having surgery. It's to do with adults who have had no surgery, have taken no drugs, are completely male-bodied, self-identifying in the sense of just feeling, saying, I feel like a woman, and that's enough to get them on the women's sports team. That's enough to get them into the changing room or the prison if they're convicted. So it's quite unbelievable, but there are male convicted rapists of women in women's prisons in the UK because they say they're women. Some of them don't even have a legal change of status because you can have a gender recognition certificate in the UK. So, these are extreme policies, again, I keep stressing, that will be used against the left. They're coming mostly from a supposedly progressive perspective. But if you stand back and look at them, they are crazy. So we need to find different accommodations, like trans women who feel threatened if they're put in prison. They need to have a separate, trans women wing of the prison or something.
I didn't want to undermine your position, but don't these examples are just extreme, isolated cases?
No, they're not. Well, first of all, I reject the premise that an isolated case is not important, because it's very important for the women, the vulnerable women. Often, women in prison in the UK are therefore very small, usually non-violent crimes. There's a large proportion of them that have trauma or abuse in their past. There's a large proportion that have been homeless. So it's a very dispossessed and vulnerable community that end up in prison. Why should, even if it was an isolated incident, why should any woman have to be incarcerated with a male rapist? Because he says he's a woman. That is not justice. So I get slightly irritated at this. Oh, well, it's only a few people being harmed, because the left doesn't normally think like that. They don't normally think, oh, it's only a few people, we don't care. So there's that. But secondly, it's a growing phenomenon. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's, in California, in Canada, in Ireland, in the UK, and probably other countries too. And there are parliaments. The Dutch parliament is discussing self-ID at the moment. It's on the books in Germany. It's constantly in the background in the UK. The Conservatives have pushed it away, but if Labour get in, they might bring it back. So it's actually in quite a lot of places, and that adds up to quite a lot of injustice when it's used and operationalized.
I did mention in the introduction for our interview that you had to make the decision to leave your previous academic position at Sussex University, and mostly because you were labeled as a so-called transphobic person.
Yes.
And there is this prestigious UK LGBT charity called Stonewall, which defines transphobia, and I quote, the fear or dislike of someone based on the fact that they are trans, including denying their gender identity or refusing to accept it. Yeah. It seems to me that you are opposing this categorization.
Well,
why?
Yes. Well, it's too broad. I mean, it's that last clause, equating fear or hatred of trans people with refusal to accept gender identity. Now, of course, that's a bit vague, but if I'm running a female sports team and a male comes in and says, I'm a woman, can I join your sports team? Well, or can I play against your sports team? And I say, sorry, your gender identity is not relevant to whether this is a fair thing to ask. That would be construed as refusing to accept his gender identity. Yeah. So it's too broad. I mean, I accept people's gender identity. If you tell me you feel like a woman, I'll say, okay, I accept that. I'm not going to try and argue you out of that. But when it comes to practical consequences of like which space you enter, which sports team you join, which rape crisis service you use, how your data is collected, I refuse to accept it, because if we accept it, we will lose sex-based rights. And I think women need protection from men. So.
In your book, you write that nowadays feminism is expected as being, everybody's mom. But I think for a viewer who didn't read your book, it seems to be a very nice idea. But you're arguing against this kind of a concept of feminism.
Yes.
What is your reason?
I said it was everybody's mum because you get this asinine phrase now, feminism is for everyone. Like, no, it's not. It clearly isn't. It's for women. It was always for women and girls. It becomes absolutely pointless, hopeless, trivial if it's for everyone. Of course, there is, as far as I can see, no other social justice movement that thinks that they don't have a right to organize for one particular group. You don't find that with gay men. You don't find that with ethnic groups. Nobody says of the people, who run a charity for African American men, oh, you need to be more inclusive, you need to have all these other groups. But women are told, you can't have anything for yourself, you have to include men, basically. And lesbians are told that they have to include men as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's actually a phenomenon based on biological sex. So you can erase all the language, but you'll still have the injustices, the discrimination, the unequal structures. They'll still be there. We just won't have language to describe them or any language to criticize them. So I just think the whole idea that feminism is for everyone is self-defeating. You might as well just abolish feminism at that point.
And you are also arguing against intersectionality.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I don't think I am. I'm arguing against a kind of populist view of intersectionality.
Which is?
Well, I suppose the idea that, it's usually used in the context of arguing that trans women are women. that somehow there are two classes of women, the cis women and the trans women, and you have to, I don't know, there's such thing as cis privilege, so there's a kind of hierarchy, and trans women are always sort of above cis women. And then
sorry, I think it would be important for our viewers to explain what cis is.
Well, cis is a concept that has emerged with gender identity ideology or trans ideology, and it suggests that it's someone who isn't trans, basically. Cis, there are cis people and trans people. I find it offensive because I think there's just women. We don't need to be made a subcategory of our own category. There's just women. They're not cis, they're just women. And there's trans women. And those are different. So, but yeah, what the real, where I agree with intersectionality is it's just a basic observation and a good one to keep in mind, that there are multiple intersecting ways in which you can be disadvantaged in life, you know, and it could be because you're a woman, or it could be because you're black, or it could be because you're a lesbian, or it could be because you're working class or disabled. So I don't have any disagreement with that. And those things can intersect in interesting ways, or debilitating ways. But I think actually the LGBTI movement should be more intersectional, because it should recognize that lesbians in particular suffer a double burden of discrimination. They are women and they are gay. Mm-hmm. And that is something that should be recognized and doesn't necessarily apply to trans women.
You are also arguing for feminism, which is founded or based on materiality. Even the title of your book phrases the famous Madonna song. What do you mean by that?
That we're animals. The human species is an animal species. We are located in the natural world. It's not just humans. I'm sure your viewers know this. Everybody does, but there are males and females throughout the mammalian world, throughout the plant world, throughout, basically throughout most of the world, the biological life world, and we're in it. So women are born, or girls, baby girls are born with a set of capacities and dispositions on average that differentiate them from males, and a set of bodily aspects that differentiate them from males. And they make a difference to the interaction between the sexes, because women on average are smaller and weaker, physically weaker and slower than the average male. And males have a sexual interest in women, and that results in a lot of violence for women. And so if feminism can't talk about that, because you can't talk about the biological sexes, then there's not much for feminism to do anymore. There's a huge number of social effects of biology. And in saying that someone like me is transphobic for wanting to talk about biology, they're just shutting down those conversations. Like, why is it unfair that a massive great man competes in a swimming race with smaller, very fit women who've trained for years? Why is that unfair? Because he's a male. And males have different set of natural capacities to women,
There is another counter-argument. So you're a cis woman on their wording.
No, I'm not.
In their wording. And so why you should have an opinion on this? If we say, for instance, only women have uterus, men shouldn't have, a say on reproductive rights.
So, sorry, what's the challenge? That I shouldn't talk about trans rights because I'm not trans? I'm a woman?
Because you don't have the personal experience, like men didn't have the personal experience of having a uterus.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm not much of a fan generally of those arguments which says that only the group in question has the right to say anything about this particular political issue, because we live in a world together and one set of demands will always affect other people. So you should allow everyone to have a say. They're affected. But in this issue, where the activist demands are so extreme, They are basically not making the demands of the male population. They're not asking men to give up their sports teams or their prizes or their spaces. They're asking women to do it. So of course I should have a say, and every other woman should have a say on this. And then we should all have a say about what's happening to children, because we're all invested in the future generations. So I think that's rubbish.
Okay. And if we put it in a more broad sense, what would be your philosophical argument against gender identity, or the understanding of gender identity as the trans community says?
Well, as I try to do in the book, I try to sort of expose the pseudo-philosophical roots of gender identity theory, which, you know, gender identity theory is a whole big bunch of influences, some of it postmodern, some of it populist, some of it from the internet, some of it from teenagers, some of it from capitalism, but all shoved together. But there is a sort of common core of this idea that your gender identity is kind of in you. Stonewall defined it as an innate sense of whether you're male or female, but has nothing to do with the sex assigned at birth. So the idea is somehow that when you come out of the womb, there's a kind of relatively arbitrary assigning of sex, but that your gender identity can later kind of emerge out of you. And once it's here, you know, you've got to pay attention to it. Only you can tell what it is. Everyone else has to accept it, or they're transphobic. So this is a kind of bit like, it's very dualist. It's a bit like, you know, Cartesian dualism, or it's a bit like a Christian idea of a soul that's in you. It's got lots of connections to older philosophical schemes. My objection is that there's no evidence that there's something innate that's your gender identity. There's no evidence that everyone has one. What there is some people have dysphoria. Some people feel, I mean, personally speaking, I don't feel very comfortable as a woman. You know, I'm sort of attracted to the masculine for myself, not sexually, but, you know, as a kind of identity. But that doesn't mean I was born that way, or that, I mean, that's emerged through context and social conditioning and complicated things about development, no doubt. And it's also not more important than my sex, because the sex is what everyone else sees. The sex is not social. Sex has social consequences, but the sex is a natural fact about me that could not be changed through, nothing could change my sex. Basically, my sex is my sex. Okay. And you know what sex I am, I know what sex you are, I didn't have to ask you your pronouns, you know. So it's partly my argument is against the prioritization of gender identity over sex. You know, there's no ethical or political defense of it as far as I can see.
We are in Hungary, where an authoritarian right-wing government has been in power in the past 12 years. And they are not just only criticizing trans and queer trans from the West, but also treating women so lightly as mother. Recently introduced the so-called heartbeat law. Women seeking abortion obliged to, you know, get a kind of listener pulsation of the future heart of the fetus. Excludes gays and lesbians from adoption of children, and also there is a serious introduction banning sexual education in schools. So some would say that the right-wing government of Hungary can use your arguments for more oppression against not just trans people, but lesbians, gays, and so on. What would be your argument against this kind of a criticism?
Well, first of all, they would have to, if they'd read my book in its entirety, for the right wing to use my arguments, they would have to pick out certain bits and leave other bits. Because I say very explicitly that trans people should be protected under the law. They should be protected from discrimination. They should not be fired because they're trans. They should not be aggressed because they're trans. They should not be made homeless because they're trans or suffer because they are gender non-conforming in any way. So I don't think I'm aligned, as far as I can tell, with the right, with Orban right on that. So they would have to definitely pick out bits. And the bits would not be on their own enough to establish that I was on the right or that I agreed with any of that. Also, I'm a lesbian, and I'm basically arguing for protection of sexual orientation, you know, which I think is very, very important, of homosexual sexual orientation, just as important as heterosexual orientation. And I am a mother, you know, so, and I'm a lesbian mother, so I don't fit really very neatly into that more traditional conservative setup. But I do agree that it's incredibly uncomfortable that people like me are put in a position where both from the left and the right we are being attacked because we're trying to hold the line. We're not saying it's all harmful, but we're not saying it's all fine. We're trying to say, no, look, there's some serious harmful consequences about some of this that we really need to think about. There's balancing of rights, there's protection of children, it's all those things that everyone should care about from whatever political perspective they're from. And the left is telling me you need to shut up because you're helping the right. I think that is suicidal for the left because it will be used against all of us eventually. You know, it will be used against me. It will be used against any gay person. The more extreme the liberal, neoliberal societies become in their transactivist demands, the more radical the demands, you know, children can have surgery or, you know, men can be in women's sports teams or men can occupy women's positions in politics. All of that will just be a gift to the right, absolute gift. And so somebody like me and various others have to hold the line. We just have to. Otherwise, we'll all suffer.
And there's a closing question. Where are we heading right now? So is this cause already lost for the left? What are the possible prospects? So what is your position on this issue?
Well, I mean, I don't have a global overview, and most of my discussion pertains to the UK, where things are very extremely polarized. But I think there's a moderate grounds for hope on the front of what's happening to children and to teenagers. And that's because, for instance, countries like the UK and Sweden and Holland that have been at the front of this medicalization of children thing. I mean, it came from Holland in the first place, the Dutch protocol of giving puberty blockers to children, and Sweden, the Karolinska Institute was really going ahead with that, and in London, the Tavistock Clinic. Anyway, all of these clinics have now drawn back and have started to look at evidence, started to do proper evidence-based protocols about what happens over many years to children who've taken these drugs and what the outcomes are. There's an enormous wave of detransitioners in their 20s and 30s who have lost body parts. Some of them have lost their wombs or their ovaries, have had major surgery. Some of the women have facial hair. You know, their voices have changed, and there's psychological distress in this population because they've been rejected by their peers and nobody else knows what to do with them. There's no particular medical pathways for them. So the medical profession is now slowly getting involved properly and recognizing this as something that needs to be handled with extreme care. And that gives me hope that there will be regulations brought in, proper regulations based on evidence, not crazy activist ideologies, which will then gradually spread out through the rest of the world, I hope. That's children. What happens with women's rights in prisons, for instance, in California or the UK or Ireland? Are we going to carry on putting male rapists in women's prisons? I hope not, but I just don't know if people care about vulnerable women like that. I just don't know if the liberal elites care enough about dispossessed, financially impoverished, abused women. So that's what my challenge to the left is live by your principles. If you care about traumatized, vulnerable, poor women, protect them from this set of ideas which is harming them.
Kathleen, thank you very much for coming to the show and also for answering my questions with such honesty.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Ez volt a beszélgetésem Kathleen Stock filozófussal. Mindenképpen iratkozz a csatornára, ha még nem tetted volna meg, hogy a továbbiakban nem maradj le a hasonló tartalmakról. Ha van bármilyen kérdésed vagy észrevétel az elhangzottakról, akkor pedig várunk a komment szekcióban. Ha megtetted, kérlek, hogy fizess elő a partnerre, ezzel is segítve a munkánkat a leírásban található lehetőségeken keresztül. Én Gulyás Márton voltam, a teljes csapat nevében köszönöm szépen a figyelmedet, hamarosan találkozunk, addig is, ciao.